Hello guys. If you followed my channel for a while, you'll know that I've started to use 3D printing in my modelling recently. I started in 2021 when I bought my Anycubic Photon Mono, starting by printing a single figure and a small vignette. Then I moved on to this lovely set of US figures, which I still need to paint. Since then I've used 3D printing to print a lot of accessories, including a lot of the rubble and bits and pieces in my Stalingrad factory. I've designed a few simple pieces to print, like these windows for my Ardennes diorama, and my upcoming LCM diorama will feature a lot of 3D printed jerry cans. And I've even 3D printed these lovely complete kits from Sparty72 on Cults 3D. So when Creality offered me their new Halot Mage Pro 3D printer, I did kind of ask myself, what advantage would it offer me? I'm happy with my Creality Halot 1 Plus. I'm not particularly fussed about always upgrading to the latest technology, even if it's given to me for free, to be honest. And I didn't want to do just another 3D printer review because I'm not a 3D printing channel. I'm interested in how we can use these tools to help us build better models. So I thought if I'm going to try the Mage Pro, then I want to try something that will really push its capabilities, and I want to try something that I can't do on my current printer. The Mage Pro's key selling points are its 8K screen and its large build volume. With a layer height of 50 micrometers, the Mage Pro is the same as my Halo 1, and although the bigger build plate would maybe allow me to print 50 jerry cans rather than 30 at one time, that's not a particularly huge advantage. I think the key selling point here is the build volume of this printer. It should enable us to print bigger models that physically would not fit inside something like the Halo 1, for example. By coincidence, I recently came across this website here, Aladdin Model. It's a subscription service offering a lot of models for 3D printing. I'm not affiliated with it, I just pay for the service and use it. And I thought the models here would be exactly what I'm looking for in this test. So I'm not going to give you a full rundown of how to set up this printer and how to use it. I'm more interested in showing you the results and what it's capable of. However, I will show you a few things I noticed as I set it up. The first thing I noticed about the printer is that it's big. Maybe that sounds obvious, but still, it's big. It's not super heavy, but it is big. And you will need some extra space behind it as well for the ventilation piping, which I'll show you in a moment. The second thing, this lid. Very nice for a couple of reasons. Firstly, it's orange, so I can see through it. The Halo 1 Plus I use has a dark blue screen like this, and you just can't see through it. You can't see what's been printed. It's really hard to see if your print is going on, or if it's failed, and so on. This orange lid makes it dead easy to see through. Small change, but really useful. Secondly, it flips up. You don't need to remove it from the printer. Again, that sounds like a minor point, but it is incredibly useful. If you're wearing resin-covered gloves, having to lift off the lid and then find somewhere on your desk to place it is quite annoying. And you end up with resin all over the outside of the screen, and then you've got to wear gloves every time you touch it and so on. This simple change to a hinged lid is a huge bonus. Thirdly, the build plate moves fast. This footage isn't sped up, it does move that fast. That doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get light speed printing, I'll talk more about that later, but it does make things faster. Fourthly, we have this resin autofill auto-emptying tube. To be honest, I didn't use it. I'm happy pouring the resin in by hand, I'm happy pouring it out by hand. I did, however, fight this little pipe thing every time I had to replace the resin vat because it really gets in the way. And yes, I know if I use this feature, I wouldn't need to replace the resin vat every so often, but the way this works is it has a tube that comes out the back and it goes into your resin bottle. And I don't really want an open bottle of resin on my desktop. I think it's asking for trouble. I can envisage the tube and the force of the resin going through it, pulling over a half-empty bottle of resin, and then the machine continuing to pump out resin all over the desk, all over my floor, completely oblivious to the situation. And I don't want that. I've got no evidence to say that's going to happen other than my own paranoia, but I didn't want to risk it. Fifthly, the user interface. It's pretty much the same as the previous Creality printers that I've used. It's easy enough to use, except for one rather weird feature they've now introduced, which is scrolling text on the buttons. It genuinely makes it much harder to read. If you're trying to find the model you want to print in a list of files, it's now really hard, with 6 different pieces of text all scrolling past in front of your eyes. Bit of a strange change. Yeah, it's a minor criticism, but it is annoying. Finally, the printer has an internal carbon filter with an attachment point on the back to run a hose out to a vent or out a window. It's a really nice feature. The previous printer I used, the Halot 1 Plus, had a carbon filter but nothing to attach any piping. Creality only supply a metre of piping with this, which barely reaches anywhere, so I just bought another couple of meters from Amazon. It's 40mm diameter and I replaced it with that. It's a really nice feature and it lets me take those fumes right outside the window. Leveling 3D printers needs to be done before first use and then every so often while you're using it. This was done in the same way as any other printer I've used. You loosen the screws on the build plate, put a thin sheet of paper over the screen, and then use the on-screen controls to lower the build plate onto the screen. Once it's in place, you then do the screws back up nice and tight. In terms of models to print, I thought I'd give the printer a slightly gentle start, and I selected this Ford GPA Amphibious Jeep. I thought that's a good size model. I know it's possible to print it on a smaller printer too, but as a warm-up I thought it was a good project. And then just under 3 hours later the printer was finished, and this is what was on our build plate. By way of comparison, I sliced this model for my old printer, my Halot 1 Plus, and this printer as well. And the slicing software said that the old printer would take 4 hours and 46 minutes, and this would take 2 hours and 55 minutes. So that's roughly a 40% time saving with this new printer. I'll show you close-ups of the results later in the video, but after printing the Ford GPA, I decided to move on to its sort of a bigger cousin, as it were, the DUKW or Duck. This is an absolutely huge model. The real thing is 31 feet long, so in 1/35th scale this is over 10.5 inches long, and as you can see it virtually fills the volume there of the Mage Pro. In fact, on the top right of your image you can see it started to lift away from the build plate, perhaps due to the weight, but the model did print successfully. Then I went for another big vehicle. This time quite an unusual one, and one I haven't seen a kit of. This is the Australian AC-1 Sentinel tank from World War II. This took 6.5 hours compared to a projected 9.25 hours on the Halot 1. However, that's a bit disingenuous because the model doesn't fit on the build plate of the Halot 1, and we would have needed to split it in two and do 2 separate prints, and that probably would add a few more hours to that time. Finally, I decided to go big or go home, and I selected this Matador Refueler model. Not a small model even in 1/48 scale, I decided to do this in 1/35th, and that really pushed us almost to the limit of the height there on the Mage Pro. And unfortunately, despite multiple tries, I did end up going home. I couldn't get this to print successfully. I think part of the reason was the Creality resin that I used. I'll talk more about that later, but I think if I'd had some more of my Anycubic resin, that would have been perhaps a little bit better. I'm not going to give up on that, however, so I am going to have another go at printing it, and I'll make another video if I successfully manage to do so. So let's take a close-up look at the quality of the prints now. This is after they've all been washed and cured, and they were all printed using water washable resin. So here is our Ford GPA, which as you can see has come out rather nicely indeed. Very clear details there, both in terms of the larger details like the ribbing on the side and the finer details inside the cockpit. Of course, there are some simplifications to the model here, for example the slight lack of cockpit detail. That's not the fault of the printer, of course. The small uneven areas here on the rear and the underside are where I removed the supports, and of course they'll need sanding. Here is one of the wheels which were printed. Again, the tread is very nicely represented. and that would just pop onto the side. Unfortunately, I did break off part of the suspension arm there when I removed the supports. We do have a couple of extra details for the cockpit there which were printed separately. So here is the steering wheel and some of the gear levers, with obviously the supports not yet removed. And here is the window framework. Of course, one thing about 3D printing is you don't generally get the clear parts, but we can make those by hand. Here is that a splash guard at the front, I think? I think the printer has done a good job here of representing that 3D model. There's certainly no layer lines visible, for example. And if I head over to my shelf to find one of the earliest models I ever built, way before I had my YouTube channel, here is my Tamiya 1/35th scale for GPA. Now again, we're not comparing the accuracy here of the model because that depends on the person who made the 3D models, but I think it is just quite nice to look at the two side by side. The seats look decent. There are some changes on the front and on the interior. I'm not sure, to be honest, if that's just different variants of the GPA or if it's a lack of detail on the 3D model. That's something I'll have to look up. Moving on to the duck, and this is how it came out of the printer. It's massive, as you can see, got all those supports there. Luckily on the underside, or mostly on the underside, so it's not such a problem. We do have a bit of a problem with the wheels. A couple of those failed. You can see the fourth one along there just didn't stay attached to its supports and fell off into the resin bed. And a couple of the other ones have a bit of a split in them too. Despite the build leaving the build plate slightly on the corner, that hasn't twisted the model, luckily. So if we can detach this and remove the supports, we can have a look at the final result. One of the biggest issues with these huge models is the difficulty in cleaning them and curing them. Particularly because a lot of them are hollow, you can wash out the resin from inside, but it's really hard to get a UV light inside them to make sure you cure that resin fully on the inside. And if you don't, that's going to continue off-gassing for quite a long time, and you really don't want that in your model room while it's doing that. The other issue is that Creality do make a wash and cure machine with a large enough capacity for the Mage Pro, but they didn't send me one, so I had to use my good old Anycubic wash and cure machine, which is tiny, and sort of shoehorn the models into them. Anyway, here is the duck after washing and curing, and it's come out very nicely indeed, I think. I can see myself adding lots of stowage to the back of this. The cockpit detail is maybe a little out of scale, but that's a result of the model, not the printer. There are a couple of marks on the side, sort of almost like layer lines going diagonally there. Not quite sure what they are. Hopefully they would be able to be hidden by some primer or possibly just by a bit of sanding. But the details are nice and fine on the nose, the bonnet, the hood, whatever you want to call it. And I could see with a little bit of scratch building and some reference photos, this could become quite a nice model indeed. Finally, the Sentinel tank. Lovely finish on this one. Look at all this detail here on the running gear on the side. That's printed out really fantastically, even with the guide teeth there for the tracks. I did damage two of the track sections when I removed the supports, but that was entirely my fault. I think the tracks could do with a bit of alignment there. They're a bit odd on top, aren't they? A little bit sort of loose and wavy, like they need to be pushed down onto those return rollers. The turret, of course, was printed separate, so it's rotatable. There's a few of the supports that need to be removed still, but overall, really nice indeed. But great detail on the rear as well. The rivets are visible on the rear and the engine deck. Slight split in the hatch there on the cockpit. But overall, a really good job. We do have some layer lines there on the front, but far fewer than with other printers that I've used. So those were our models, and I think overall, generally that was a good set of results. I think things printed well, the quality was good. There were no noticeable layer lines compared to my earlier 4K and 2K printers. The printing speed was good too, I mean, it easily knocked off 30% compared to my previous printers, which is a real bonus. It kind of makes a difference between leaving things to print overnight and having them ready today. And of course, that's particularly useful with the really big prints. The carbon filter and piping, once I'd replaced it with my own piping, worked really well to keep those fumes down. So overall, would I recommend this printer? Well, I think if you're fairly experienced with 3D printing, and you know that you want to produce big prints, and you're in the market for an 8K printer, I'd say it's a solid bet with a good feature set. If you're yet to try 3D printing, I think you'd probably be better off with something smaller and cheaper to see if it really is for you. The 3D printing workflow, particularly the post-processing and the safety requirements, are just not for everyone. And of course, the cost is not just the outlay of the 3D printer itself, but realistically, you do really need a wash and cure machine too. And of course, the bigger the 3D printer, the bigger the wash and cure machine you need, so the more expensive that will be too. Creality do a range of smaller printers, and they have frequent discounts and sales, as do other manufacturers. My first printer was an Anycubic Photon Mono, and it served me really well. I was very happy with it. So I think a lot really depends on your use case for this printer. Before I go, just a few extra notes. In terms of software, I use Chitubox for slicing. Creality do include their own slicer software, Halot Box, but I just prefer Chitubox. I've used it since the beginning, I've used it with all my printers, so it makes sense to just carry on using it really. In fact, Creality do include a free 1-year license for the Pro version of Chitubox with the Mage Pro, which suggests they're kind of acknowledging the popularity there of that software compared to their own. On the subject of that resin pump, I still haven't used it, but it has caused some drips for me. Basically, because the nozzle reaches into the resin vat, it gets resin on it. And whenever you remove the resin vat, the nozzle will still have a few drops of resin on it. Inevitably, these drip down onto the area surrounding the screen, and capillary action of the little ridge around there tends to pull that resin around the edge of the screen. Not good. It's only a matter of time before I end up getting resin from that onto my screen, and so I'm looking at ways to remove the resin pump completely. I haven't mentioned networking so far. The Mage Pro does include Wi-Fi capability and an Ethernet cable port. However, you still can't print directly to the printer from your desktop. So instead you have to upload to the Creality Cloud from your slicing software, then go to your printer and re-download the file from the Creality Cloud onto your printer. Personally, I don't really see the point of that. I'm fine with USB sticks. The Creality Cloud tries to be a kind of online area for sharing 3D models, but I think for scale modelers like us, we're likely to have a couple of specific sites like Quartz 3D or CG Trader, which are more likely to have models in our niche, and the models on Creality Cloud are not likely to be useful for us. Some users maybe, but for modelers I can't really see it. Finally, resin. Creality did send me some of their water washable skin coloured resin. It's the peachy pink colour that you saw the duck and the sentinel printed in. In general, I didn't find this as reliable as the Anycubic water washable resin in the grey, which is what you saw the GPA printed in. Maybe it's just a coincidence, but every print failure that I had occurred using the skin coloured Creality resin. So given that I've had lots of experience with the Anycubic resin, it's a no-brainer for me to keep using that. Also on the subject of resin, the Mage Pro had some great print speeds for me, but you can apparently get even faster speeds by using special fast resin. I wasn't too worried about that. I like the bonus speed the Mage gives me, but I'm more concerned with quality, and quite a lot of the tests that I've seen for faster prints almost cheat by using quite large layer heights. I'd rather have the smaller layer height for the quality, so I didn't test the fast resin. Anyway guys, that was my look at the Creality Halot Mage Pro 3D printer. Hopefully my video gave you a good idea of how useful it could be from a scale modelling perspective. Of course, do remember that part of the equation is the quality of the models in the first place. I quite like the 3D models from Aladdin Models, but there were clearly some of them where they lacked a little bit of detail here and there, and of course that's not the fault of the printer. I would like to say thank you to all of you for watching this video. Special thanks to my Patreon supporters and YouTube members who support the channel on an ongoing basis. It's massively appreciated, and the feedback and discussions that we have on the Patreon and YouTube members pages are incredibly useful for helping me guide the future of my channel. So thank you very much, guys. I'm going to continue using the Mage Pro, both to print entire models like I've been doing here, and for accessories and add-ons and customizations for my plastic model kits. If you don't want to miss a video, then be sure to subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. My YouTube community page and my Instagram page are great for following my work in progress, as are the YouTube membership and Patreon schemes which I mentioned earlier, links in the description below. Until next time, I want to say thank you again for watching, and have fun modelling.